No one expects a 40-pound apex predator to be afraid of the dark, but that was before Elias Thorne found a creature in the snow that didn't want his food. It wanted his hand to hold while it slept. The silence of the Yukon wilderness wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed against the windows of the cabin like a physical weight, made of ice, pine needles, and a darkness so absolute it felt like the end of the world. For Elias Thorne, the silence was the only company he kept these days. At 65, with hands calloused from decades of working cedar and oak, he had become part of the landscape, rough, weathered, and unyielding. The locals in the town, 40 miles down the treacherous mountain pass, called him the hermit of the ridge. They said he had lost his voice when he lost his wife, Sarah, 3 years ago. They weren't entirely wrong. Elias still spoke, but mostly to the fire, or to the half-finished carvings of eagles and wolves that cluttered his workshop. Tonight, however, the silence was broken. A blizzard was hammering the mountains, a white wolf storm, howling with a ferocity that shook the sturdy timber frames of the cabin. Elias sat in his armchair, the leather cracked and worn, watching the flames dance in the stone hearth. A mug of black coffee cooled in his hand. He wasn't afraid of the storm. He was waiting for it to pass, just as he waited for the days to pass, one after another, indistinguishable and gray. Then he heard it. It wasn't the wind. The wind screamed. This sound was a scratch. A desperate, rhythmic scraping against the heavy oak of the front door. Elias froze. Bears should be hibernating. Wolves didn't knock. And no human would be foolish enough to be out on Whispering Ridge in this weather unless they were already dead. He set the coffee down. His knees popped as he stood, a reminder of the cold seeping into his bones. He reached for the bolt-action rifle hanging above the mantel, not out of malice, but out of habit. In the Yukon, caution kept you alive. He walked to the door, the floorboards groaning under his heavy boots. The scratching stopped, replaced by a sound that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a bark. It was a cry. A high, mewling sound, pathetic and wet, like a kitten drowning in a river. Elias unlatched the heavy iron bolt and cracked the door open. The wind slammed against him instantly, a wall of freezing needles. He squinted into the swirling white void, the lantern in the hallway casting a weak yellow rectangle onto the snow. At first, he saw nothing but the drifts piling up against the porch railing. "Hello," he grunted, his voice rusty from disuse. Then, a mound of snow near his boot shifted. Elias looked down. There, half buried, shivering so violently it shook the snow from its fur, was a shape. It was too big to be a house cat, too small to be a wolf. It was gray, mottled with black spots, and possessed tufted ears that were currently flattened against its skull in sheer terror. A Canada Lynx. The ghost of the North. They were elusive, solitary phantoms. In 40 years of living here, Elias had seen tracks, but never the cat itself. And certainly never one on his doorstep. The animal looked up. Its eyes were huge, a startling, liquid amber, rimmed with ice. It didn't hiss. It didn't bare its fangs. It opened its mouth and let out that sound again, meow, a cry so painfully human, so utterly devoid of predatory instinct, that it bypassed Elias's logic and struck him straight in the chest. "You're freezing," Elias whispered, the rifle lowering in his hand. The lynx took a step forward. It limped. Its left front paw hung uselessly, dragging in the snow. It was starving, its ribs cutting sharp lines through the wet, matted fur. It looked at the warmth spilling from the cabin, then back at Elias, trembling. Elias knew the rules of nature better than anyone. Let the wild be wild. Don't interfere. If he let it in, he was crossing a line. If he let it in, he was inviting chaos. But then the creature did something impossible. It didn't try to run past him. It didn't cower. It reached out with its good paw and swatted gently at the toe of Elias's boot, looking up at him with a desperate, pleading intensity. "Help me!" The wind roared, threatening to tear the door from its hinges. Elias cursed under his breath, a soft, resigned curse. "All right," he grumbled. "Don't make me regret this." He stepped back. The lynx hesitated for only a second before dragging itself over the threshold, collapsing onto the rug in a heap of wet fur and exhaustion. Elias slammed the door against the storm, shutting out the world. The cabin went quiet, save for the crackling fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the animal on the floor. Elias knelt, putting the rifle away. Up close, the creature was bigger than he realized, perhaps a year old, barely out of adolescence, but severely malnourished. Its paws were massive, like snowshoes, disproportionate to its emaciated body. "What happened to you, little ghost?" Elias murmured. He reached out a hand, expecting the snap of jaws. A wild animal, even a dying one, usually fought. But the lynx just watched his hand. When Elias's rough fingers brushed the ice from its ear, the cat leaned into the touch. It closed its eyes and let out a sigh that rattled in its chest. Elias's heart, a dormant thing for so long, gave a painful thud. He went into survival mode. He fetched old towels from the bathroom and a bowl of warm water. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had nursed injured hunting dogs in his youth. He gently towel-dried the shivering beast. The lynx whined when he touched the injured paw. It was swollen, likely a bad sprain from a fall, but not broken. "You're lucky," Elias told it. "Nothing's shattered." He brought a strip of raw venison from the icebox, prime meat he had been saving for a stew. He held it out. The lynx sniffed it, licked it once, and then turned its head away, looking back at Elias with wide, expectant eyes. "It's meat," Elias said, baffled. "You're a predator. Eat." The lynx chirped, a bird-like trill, and nudged Elias's knee with its head. "You don't want the meat." Elias sat back on his heels, confused. He looked at the creature's behavior. The lack of aggression, the desperate need for contact. It wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was acting like... He remembered the goat's milk he kept for his coffee. It was a long shot. He warmed some in a saucepan and poured it into a shallow bowl. He placed it on the floor. The lynx didn't hesitate. It began to lap at the warm milk frantically, getting white droplets on its whiskers. It finished the bowl in seconds and looked up for more. "Well, I'll be damned," Elias whispered. "A milk drinker." For the next hour, the storm raged outside, burying the cabin deeper in drifts. But inside, a strange truce had formed. Elias sat in his chair, and the lynx lay on the rug. But the lynx wasn't satisfied with the rug. It stood up on 3 legs, wobbling, and stared at Elias. It chirped again, louder this time. Demanding. "What?" Elias asked. "You're warm. You're fed. Go to sleep." The lynx limped over to the chair. It stood on its hind legs, placing its massive front paws on Elias's knee. Its claws were sheathed. It looked at Elias, then at the empty space on the wide leather chair beside his leg. "No," Elias said sternly. "Absolutely not. You are a wild animal. You have fleas. You smell like a wet dog." The lynx stared at him. It blinked slowly. Then, with a grunt of effort, it hauled itself up. Elias tensed, ready to shove it off. But the animal didn't attack. It curled itself into a tight ball right against Elias's thigh, fitting itself into the curve of his body as if it were the missing piece of a puzzle. It rested its heavy head on Elias's leg and let out a sound that vibrated through the chair. A purr. But not just a purr, it was deep, resonant, like a low-idling diesel engine. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the animal. He should push it away. This was dangerous. This was insane. But the warmth of the creature seeped through his jeans. The rhythmic rise and fall of its flank against his leg was hypnotic. Slowly, tentatively, Elias lowered his hand. His fingers buried themselves in the thick, soft fur behind the lynx's neck. The lynx let out a sharp, happy chirp and pressed harder against him. Elias looked at the empty rocking chair across the room, Sarah's chair. It had sat empty for 3 years. The silence of the cabin had been a vacuum, sucking the life out of him day by day. But now there was this weight, this warmth, this impossible creature that trusted him for no reason at all. "You're a fool," Elias whispered to the cat, his voice cracking. "And I'm an old fool." The lynx fell asleep instantly, twitching as it dreamed. Elias didn't sleep. He watched the fire die down to embers. He watched the shadows stretch across the walls. He listened to the wind trying to tear the roof off. Around 3 a.m., the power died. The hum of the refrigerator cut out. The hallway light flickered and died. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the dull red glow of the hearth. The temperature began to drop immediately. The insulation in the old cabin was good, but a Yukon blizzard was relentless. Elias shivered. The cold woke the lynx. The cat lifted its head, its eyes reflecting the dying embers like two burning coins. It sensed the change in the atmosphere. It sensed the cold creeping in. "It's okay," Elias whispered in the dark. "Just a power line down." The lynx wasn't comforted. It stood up on the chair, balancing awkwardly. It looked at the dark corners of the room and let out a low, uneasy whine. It began to pace on the small cushion, stepping on Elias's legs, restless and anxious. "Hey, hey," Elias soothed, reaching out. The lynx grabbed his hand. It didn't bite. It wrapped its two front paws around Elias's wrist and forearm, hugging the limb to its chest. It pressed its wet nose into Elias's palm and held on tight. Elias sat there, stunned in the freezing dark. The apex predator, the ghost of the woods, was holding his hand because it was afraid of the dark. "You're not a ghost," Elias murmured, using his thumb to stroke the velvet fur of the cat's nose. "Ghosts don't get scared." The lynx squeezed his arm tighter, its claws pricking the flannel shirt but not breaking skin. It needed an anchor. "Okay," Elias said softly. "I've got you. I'm here." He used his free hand to pull the heavy wool blanket from the back of the chair, draping it over both of them. He created a cocoon against the encroaching freeze. Under the wool, the heat of the man and the heat of the wild cat merged. For the first time in 3 years, Elias Thorne wasn't just existing. He was protecting. "I can't keep calling you cat," Elias whispered into the darkness. The lynx shifted, settling its chin on Elias's wrist, finally relaxing now that it was held. Sarah used to love the constellations. She would point them out on clear winter nights. The brightest one, the hunter. "Orion," Elias said. "Your name is Orion." The cat, Orion, let out a soft puff of air against Elias's palm, almost like an agreement. As the storm raged toward dawn, burying the world in white, Elias sat awake, holding the paw of a creature that shouldn't exist, feeling the ice around his own heart begin to crack, just a little. But morning would bring light. And light would bring reality. The storm would end, and the tracks leading to his door would be visible. Elias knew that keeping a wild animal was illegal. He knew that if the rangers found out, they would take Orion away. Or worse, they would put him down, citing danger to the public. And there was something else. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the frosted windows, Elias noticed something on the cat's neck that he had missed in the darkness and the dirt. A patch of fur on the scruff was matted down in a peculiar way. Not by nature. Elias leaned in, squinting in the low light. He gently separated the fur. There, faint but unmistakable, was a mark. An impression in the skin where a collar had once been worn tight. A collar that had been recently removed. Orion wasn't just a wild animal that had stumbled in. He wasn't just a miracle of nature. Someone had kept him. Someone had raised him. And judging by the fear in the animal's eyes when the wind howled, and the desperate way he clung to Elias's hand, that someone hadn't been kind. Elias looked at the sleeping face of the lynx, innocent and peaceful. A surge of protective anger, hot and unfamiliar, flooded his veins. "Who hurt you?" Elias whispered, his voice hard as granite. Orion didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on Elias's hand, dreaming of a safety he had finally found. Elias looked at the window. The snow had stopped falling, but the drifts were 5 feet high. They were trapped. Just the two of them. "Let them come," Elias said to the empty room. "Let them try to take you." He leaned his head back against the chair, exhausted, terrified, and for the first time in a long time, alive. But Elias didn't know that the storm hadn't just brought a cat. It had brought a secret. And down in the valley, where the snowplows were just starting to clear the roads, a black truck was idling, its driver looking up toward the ridge with a tracking device in his hand, watching a blinking red light that pointed straight at Elias's cabin. The ghost had been found. And the hunt was just beginning. The blizzard broke 2 days later, leaving the world scoured clean and blindingly white. The silence returned to Whispering Ridge, but inside the cabin, the heavy, suffocating quiet that had haunted Elias for 3 years was gone. It had been replaced by a new rhythm, the crackle of the fire, the scrape of a carving knife against cedar, and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a purr that sounded less like a cat and more like a idling tractor. Elias sat at his workbench, the morning sun streaming through the frosted window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He was working on the wing of a wooden eagle, trying to capture the tension of flight in the grain of the wood. Normally, this was his sacred time. No interruptions. No noise. But today, he had a supervisor. Orion sat on a stool dragged right up to the workbench. He didn't sit like a cat, perched on all fours. He sat on his haunches, his back legs splayed out, his front paws resting on the edge of the table like a man waiting for his dinner order. His golden eyes tracked every movement of the chisel. "You're crowding me," Elias grumbled, blowing wood shavings off the eagle. Orion didn't move. He leaned forward and sniffed the cedar, his nose wrinkling. Then, with a dexterity that shouldn't have been possible for a paw designed to crush snow and bone, he reached out and gently tapped the handle of the chisel. "Chirp." "No," Elias said, not looking up. "Sharp." "Not a toy." Orion let out a dramatic, frustrated sigh, a huff of air through his nose, and slumped on the stool, resting his chin on his paws, watching Elias with the bored expression of a teenager forced to watch a documentary. It had been 48 hours since the storm, and Elias's understanding of the natural world was being dismantled, piece by piece. The lynx was not a wild animal. Biologically, yes. He had the tufted ears, the massive paws, the short, black-tipped tail. But spiritually, mentally, he was something else entirely. Yesterday, Elias had tried to feed him raw elk meat again. Orion had looked at it with disdain, then looked at the pot of beef stew bubbling on the stove. He hadn't eaten until Elias, feeling ridiculous, had ladled a portion of the cooked stew, cooled down, into a bowl. Orion had eaten it neatly, without spilling a drop, and then licked his chops with the satisfaction of a gourmand. He didn't like the floor. He preferred chairs. Specifically, he preferred Elias's chair. If Elias got up to use the restroom, he would return to find a 40-pound lynx sprawled across the leather, feigning deep sleep, refusing to move until Elias bribed him with a head scratch. But the most disquieting behavior was the night terrors. The first night hadn't been a fluke. Every night, when the lights went out, Orion would panic. He would pace, whine, and claw at the blankets until Elias relented and let him onto the bed. There, the apex predator would curl up against Elias's back, bury his face in the flannel shirt, and hold Elias's arm with his paws. Only then would he sleep. "You think you're people, don't you?" Elias muttered to the cat now. Orion's ears twitched. He reached out and knocked a small block of sandpaper off the table. He watched it fall, then looked at Elias. "Pick it up," the look said. Elias sighed, put down his chisel, and picked up the sandpaper. "I am not your servant." He wasn't. But as he looked at the animal, he felt a strange sensation in his chest. The ice that had encased his heart since Sarah died wasn't just cracking, it was melting. He found himself humming as he worked, an old folk tune Sarah used to love. When he started humming, Orion's head shot up. The cat stared at him, eyes wide. Then, incredibly, Orion opened his mouth and let out a series of broken, melodic chirps. The pitch rose and fell, mimicking the cadence of the song. Elias stopped humming. He stared at the cat. "You like music?" Orion stood up on the stool, leaning in close, and bumped his forehead against Elias's. A headbutt. A sign of affection, yes, but also a demand. "Don't stop." "Okay," Elias whispered, his throat tight. "Okay." He went back to humming. The lynx settled down, purring in harmony. For a few hours, the cabin felt like a home again. By early afternoon, the sun was high enough to melt the ice on the porch. Elias knew he couldn't hide in the cabin forever. He needed firewood from the shed, and he needed to check the perimeter. "Stay," he told Orion, pointing a stern finger at the rug. Orion blinked, looking innocent. Elias put on his heavy coat, grabbed his gloves, and stepped out into the blinding white day. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and ozone. He took a deep breath, savoring the bite of the cold. He walked to the woodshed, his boots crunching loudly. He loaded his arms with split logs. As he turned to head back, something caught his eye near the tree line, about 50 yards from the cabin. The snow was disturbed. Elias dropped the wood. He walked over, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on his belt. There were tracks. But they weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. Heavy, deep treads. Someone had stood there, recently, watching the cabin. And judging by the cigarette butt crushed into the snow, a brand Elias didn't recognize. They hadn't been just passing through. Elias scanned the tree line. The forest was silent, but it felt different now. Watched. He hurried back to the cabin, bolting the door behind him. "We have a problem," he said to the room. The room was empty. Orion. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his gut. He checked the bedroom. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. Orion. He heard a muffled noise from the bathroom. He pushed the door open. Orion was there. He had managed to nudge the door open. He was standing on his hind legs, his front paws resting on the rim of the porcelain sink. He was staring into the mirror. But he wasn't just staring. He was making faces. He would bare his teeth, then relax. He would flatten his ears, then perk them up. He was studying his own reflection with a level of self-awareness that was terrifyingly human. When he saw Elias in the mirror, he didn't startle. He just chirped, as if to say, "Look at this handsome devil." Elias didn't smile this time. He grabbed the lynx, who protested with a squawk, and carried him into the living room. "Listen to me," Elias said, holding the cat's face between his hands. The lynx went still, sensing the shift in Elias's mood. "Someone is out there. Someone who knows you're here." Orion's pupils dilated. He leaned into Elias's hands, trembling slightly. Elias sat down with the cat in his lap. He needed to know what he was dealing with. He ran his hands over Orion's neck, finding the matted fur where the collar had been. He felt something else. Just behind the left ear, under the skin, there was a small, hard lump. A microchip. No, it felt bigger. Like a capsule. Elias grabbed a small mesmerizing magnet from his toolkit. He used it to find dropped nails. He passed it near the lump. Nothing happened. Not magnetic. He parted the fur carefully. The skin there was scarred, a small white line. "What are you?" Elias whispered. Suddenly, a low, mechanical hum filled the cabin. Elias froze. It was coming from outside. A buzzing sound, like a swarm of angry hornets. Orion heard it too. He hissed, the first time Elias had heard him make a truly aggressive sound. He leaped from Elias's lap and dove under the heavy oak sofa, flattening himself against the floorboards. Elias went to the window, staying low. Hovering just outside the glass, staring in with a single unblinking black eye, was a drone. It was sleek, military-grade, not a toy. It hovered there for a second, scanning the interior of the cabin. Elias ducked behind the curtain, heart hammering against his ribs. The drone lingered for 10 seconds, then zipped upwards and vanished over the tree line. They weren't just looking for a lost pet. You didn't use tech like that for a stray cat. Elias moved fast. He grabbed his duffel bag from the closet. He threw in dried meat, a first aid kit, flashlights, and extra ammunition. "We can't stay here," he muttered. But before he could zip the bag, a sound echoed through the valley. Boom. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a knock. A single, thunderous pound on the front door. Elias stopped. The drone had just left. How could someone be at the door so fast? Unless the drone was just the spotter, and the hunter had been waiting on the porch steps. The knock came again. Boom, boom. "Mr. Thorne," a voice called out. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly out of place in the Yukon wilderness. "I know you're in there. And I know you have my property." Elias looked at the rifle above the mantel. He looked at the trembling shadow under the sofa. He walked to the door. He didn't open it. "I don't know who you are," Elias shouted, his voice rough. "But you're trespassing. Get off my land." "My name is Silas Vance," the voice replied, calm and amused. "And I'm afraid I can't leave. You have something that belongs to my facility. A specimen. Project 89. Project 89. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. "There's no one here but me." "Mr. Thorne," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. I have thermal imaging. I can see 2 heat signatures. One is you. The other is, well, let's just say his body temperature runs a little higher than a human's." Silence stretched. "He requires medication, Elias," Vance said, his tone shifting to false concern. "He has a condition. If he doesn't get his shots, he'll die. Is that what you want? You saved him from the storm. Don't kill him with kindness." Under the sofa, Orion let out a low, mournful wail. It wasn't a growl. It was the sound a child makes when they hear the doctor's voice. He knew who was at the door. And he was terrified. That was all the confirmation Elias needed. "He's not a project," Elias said, gripping the doorknob, his knuckles white. "And he's not sick. Open the door, Elias. Get off my porch." "I have a warrant," Vance lied. Or maybe he wasn't lying. "And I have men. Don't make this ugly. I just want the cat." Elias backed away from the door. He looked around the cabin. There was a back door, leading to the steep drop-off of the ridge. It was dangerous, almost suicidal in the snow, but it was the only way out unseen. He went to the sofa. He got down on his knees. "Orion," he whispered. "Come here." The lynx stared at him, eyes dilated with panic. "I need you to be brave," Elias said. "We're going for a walk." Orion hesitated, then crawled out. He didn't walk. He leaped into Elias's arms, burying his face in Elias's neck, shaking violently. He was heavy, 40 pounds of dead weight, but Elias held him tight. "I've got you," Elias murmured. "Last chance, Thorne." Vance yelled. The handle of the front door began to turn. Elias grabbed the duffel bag. He grabbed the rifle. He kicked the back door open. The wind hit them instantly, swirling snow into the kitchen. Elias stepped out onto the narrow, icy ledge of the back porch. Below them, the whispering ridge dropped away into a sea of white pine and shadow. Inside the cabin, the front door smashed open. "Check the rooms," Vance's voice barked. "He can't have gone far." Elias looked down at the treacherous path. He looked at the lynx clinging to his chest like a toddler. "Hold on," Elias whispered into the fur. He stepped off the porch and vanished into the trees, leaving the warmth of his life behind, walking straight into the heart of the frozen wild with a ghost in his arms. Ista kainen final balumu. Bubalumd Elias ve Orion Arasandaki Bagan Guku. Technologi ve Asimasisliga Karsi Test Edelier. Title: The Ghost of Whispering Ridge. Part 3. The Heart of the Wild. The cold on the ridge wasn't just a temperature, it was a predator. It chewed on Elias's exposed skin and seeped through the layers of his wool coat, seeking the warmth of the life inside. They had been moving for 3 hours. The sun was dipping low, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. Elias was exhausted. His lungs burned with every inhalation of the razor-sharp air. He wasn't a young man, and the duffel bag slung over his shoulder felt like it was filled with lead. But the heaviest weight was in his arms. Orion had tried to walk, but the deep snow was too much for his injured paw. So, Elias carried him. 40 pounds of dense muscle and fur, clinging to him with a desperation that defied instinct. The lynx didn't struggle. He had buried his face in the crook of Elias's neck, his warm breath hitching in a rhythm that matched Elias's own labored panting. They were heading for Dead Man's Drop, a narrow gorge about 2 miles north. There were caves there, hidden by overhangs of slate and ice. If they could make it, the thermal drones might lose them in the dense mineral rock. "Almost there, little ghost," Elias wheezed, stumbling over a buried root. Orion let out a soft, worried whimper and shifted his weight, trying to make himself lighter. He reached up with a paw and patted Elias's cheek, a clumsy, gentle gesture. "Check. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Elias lied. A mechanical buzz cut through the wind. Elias threw himself flat against the base of a massive pine tree, pulling the white camouflage tarp he'd packed over them. He held Orion tight against his chest, clamping a hand gently over the cat's muzzle. "Quiet," he breathed. Orion went rigid. He didn't need to be told. He understood the sound. The drone drifted overhead, a black beetle against the graying sky. It hovered, its camera eye swiveling. It was lower this time. Hunting. Beneath the tarp, Elias felt Orion's heart hammering against his own ribs. It was beating so fast it felt like a vibration. The lynx squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his forehead against Elias's sternum, hiding like a child who believes that if they can't see the monster can't see them. The drone lingered, the buzz rising and falling. Then, agonizingly slowly, it drifted south. Elias waited a full minute before throwing the tarp off. "We have to move. Now." They reached the gorge as the sun vanished. The terrain here was treacherous, slick ice hidden under powder snow. Elias scrambled down a rocky incline, his boots sliding. He found the fissure in the rock face he remembered from his hunting days, a narrow crack that opened into a dry, shallow cave. He collapsed inside, sliding down the wall until he hit the dirt floor. He set Orion down gently. "Safe," Elias gasped. "For now." Orion didn't relax. He paced the small cave, limping, sniffing the damp air. Then, he did something that broke Elias's heart all over again. He dragged the duffel bag over to Elias. He used his teeth to unzip it, clumsily but effectively. He rooted around until he found the water bottle and nudged it toward Elias's hand. "Drink. You're smarter than half the people I know," Elias whispered, cracking the seal and taking a long swig. He poured some into the cap for Orion. They sat in the dark, sharing a stick of beef jerky. Orion ate politely, taking small bites from Elias's fingers, careful not to graze the skin with his teeth. "Why are you like this?" Elias asked the shadows. "Who made you this way?" He got his answer an hour later. The wind outside died down, leaving an eerie silence. Into that silence came a voice, amplified by a megaphone, echoing off the canyon walls. Subject 89. Initiate protocol return. Orion, who had been dozing on Elias's lap, seized up. His eyes snapped open, the pupils blowing wide until the gold was almost gone. "Subject 89, the voice boomed, closer now. "Heal." Orion stood up. His body was trembling, fighting a war between instinct and conditioning. He took a step toward the cave entrance, his movements jerky, robotic. "No," Elias said, grabbing the lynx's scruff. "Orion, stay." The lynx whined, a high-pitched sound of distress. He looked at Elias, then at the entrance. The command was pulling him like a magnet. "I can't let them take you," Elias growled. He stood up, grabbing his rifle. "Stay here." He stepped out of the cave, into the moonlight. Standing on the ridge opposite the gorge, about 50 yards away, was a silhouette. Silas Vance. He was flanked by 2 men in tactical white winter gear, holding tranquilizer rifles. "Mr. Thorne," Vance's voice was conversational, amplified by the device in his hand. "You're a hard man to track. Old school. I respect that." "Go to hell," Elias shouted back. "I'm afraid I can't. I have $1 billion of investment sitting in that cave behind you. Do you know what Project 89 is, Elias?" Vance took a step forward. "It's not just a lynx. We mapped the neural pathways of a human toddler, cognitive empathy, problem-solving, attachment theory, and synthesized them. We wanted to see if we could create the perfect companion. A guardian that thinks like a child but fights like a demon." Vance laughed, a cold sound. "But he was defective. Too soft. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to cuddle. He failed the aggression tests." Elias felt sick. "He's a living thing, not a product." "He's a failure," Vance corrected. "And we need to dissect the failure to build the next version. Now, send him out. Or we shoot you, and take him anyway. No one will find your body out here until spring." Elias raised his rifle. "You'll have to go through me." Vance sighed. "Have it your way. Unit 1, Unit 2, take the shot." Elias braced himself. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned. But he wasn't alone. A low, guttural growl vibrated from the cave entrance. It wasn't the sound of a kitten. It wasn't the sound of a human child. It was the sound of the Yukon. Orion emerged. He wasn't limping anymore. Adrenaline had masked the pain. He stood at the edge of the ravine, his fur bristling, making him look twice his size. His ears were pinned back. His lips were pulled back, revealing teeth that were definitely not designed for smiling. "Ah," Vance said, sounding delighted. "There's the aggression. Protocol attack. Target, the old man." Vance pressed a button on a remote in his hand. A high-frequency whine pierced the air. Orion convulsed. He turned toward Elias. His eyes were glazed, confused. The conditioning was overriding his mind. He crouched, muscles coiling to spring. "Orion," Elias said softly. He lowered the rifle. He didn't aim at the cat. He dropped the weapon to the snow. "Don't do this, son," Elias whispered. It was a ridiculous thing to call a lynx, but it was the truth. Orion froze. The word hung in the air. "Son." The lynx looked at Elias. He looked at the empty hands, the open posture. He saw the man who had warmed his milk, the man who had held his paw in the dark, the man who had carried him through the snow. Orion shook his head, as if clearing water from his ears. He looked back at Vance. The human intelligence that Vance had implanted, the empathy, the reasoning, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It made a choice. Orion didn't attack Elias. He didn't attack Vance. He looked at the snowbank above Vance's head, a massive drift of unstable snow hanging heavy over the ridge. Orion looked at Elias one last time, a look of pure, mischievous calculation, the same look he gave before knocking a chisel off the table. Then he opened his mouth and let out a scream. It wasn't a meow. It was a lynx scream, a terrifying, ear-splitting shriek that echoed off the canyon walls at the perfect frequency. The vibration hit the snowbank. Crack. Vance looked up. What the? The avalanche wasn't a movie catastrophe. It was a heavy, suffocating whump of white. The shelf of snow collapsed, burying Vance and his men in seconds, sweeping them off the ridge and down into the deep powder of the gully below. It wouldn't kill them, it wasn't enough snow for that, but it would trap them. It would bury their guns, their drones, and their arrogance. Silence returned to the gorge. Elias stood there, trembling. Orion sat down in the snow. He lifted his injured paw, looked at Elias, and let out a pathetic, tiny mew. "I did good. Pick me up." Elias laughed. It was a wet, choked sound. He ran forward and scooped the massive cat into his arms. Orion immediately wrapped his legs around Elias's waist and buried his face in the wool coat, purring so hard it rattled Elias's teeth. "Yeah," Elias sobbed into the fur. "Yeah, you did good. You did real good." Epilogue. 6 months later. The town of Silver Creek, 300 miles north of Whispering Ridge, was a quiet place where people didn't ask questions. At the edge of town, there was a new wood-carving shop. The sign out front read, "Thorne and Son, Custom Carvings." Inside, the shop smelled of cedar and sawdust. Tourists would come in to buy the intricate wooden eagles and wolves. They would often comment on the beautiful, incredibly realistic statue of a lynx sleeping on the large armchair by the fire. "It looks so real," a woman said, reaching out to touch the fur. "Careful," the old man behind the counter said, his eyes twinkling. "The varnish is still wet." As soon as the woman turned away to pay, the statue opened one golden eye, winked at the old man, and then slowly, carefully, reached out a massive paw to steal the woman's glove from the counter. Elias cleared his throat. "Put it back." The lynx froze. He looked at Elias, then at the glove. He let out a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a teenager rolling his eyes, and nudged the glove back. The woman turned around. "Did you say something?" "Just talking to the wood," Elias said, smiling. "It has a mind of its own sometimes." Elias took the money and handed over the carving. As the customer left, the bell dinging above the door, Elias walked over to the armchair. He sat down. Immediately, the 40-pound lynx crawled into his lap, curled up, and grabbed Elias's thumb with his paw, holding it tight. Elias leaned back, listening to the purr that filled the room, a sound better than any silence. He wasn't the hermit of the ridge anymore. He was just a father, watching over his boy, hiding in plain sight, happy.